For more than 50 years, they stood side by side on stages across the world. Daryl Hall and John Oates created some of the most beloved songs in American pop history, selling over 40 million albums and becoming the most successful duo in rock and roll. To millions of fans, they seemed inseparable. The tall, charismatic frontman with the soulful voice and the shorter, mustached guitarist who provided the perfect musical complement. Together, they were magic. But that image was always a carefully constructed illusion. At 79, Daryl Hall has finally broken his silence about what he really thinks of the man who shared his name for decades. The words he used were not diplomatic. They were not kind. And they revealed a level of resentment that had been building behind closed doors for longer than most people could imagine. Hall didn't just express disappointment or professional frustration. He used language that cut deep, describing feelings that went far beyond ordinary business disagreements. The breaking point came in November 2023, when their decades-long partnership exploded into a very public legal battle. Hall went to court to stop Oates from selling his stake in their shared business empire to Primary Wave Music. But the lawsuit was just the visible tip of something much larger and more personal. In the aftermath, Hall began speaking openly about his partner in ways that shocked even longtime industry observers. He talked about betrayal, about broken trust, and about a relationship that had been hollow for years. What Hall revealed was not just anger about a business deal gone wrong. It was decades of accumulated frustration with a man he felt had never truly understood what their partnership meant. Hall spoke about feeling used, about carrying the creative and emotional weight of their success while watching Oates increasingly distance himself from everything they had built together. The resentment was so deep that Hall admitted he could no longer even look at Oates the same way. But the story of why Daryl Hall has grown to hate John Oates so intensely goes back much further than 2023. It begins with two young men meeting at Temple University in 1967, each bringing different dreams and different expectations to what would become one of music's most successful and ultimately most toxic partnerships. The seeds of this bitter ending were planted in those early days, when neither man fully understood what the other wanted from their collaboration. And those seeds grew in the shadows, fed by years of unspoken resentments, unequal recognition, and fundamentally different visions of what Hall and Oates were supposed to be. When Daryl Hall and John Oates first encountered each other in Philadelphia during 1967, they were running from the same violent confrontation. A gang fight had erupted at the Adelphi Ballroom, and both young musicians found themselves fleeing through the same service elevator. It was a chance meeting that would define both of their lives, though neither realized how differently they would remember those early days. Hall was already the more magnetic presence. At 19, he possessed a voice that could effortlessly shift from tender ballad to powerful soul anthem. His tall frame and striking blonde hair made him naturally photogenic, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who expected to be noticed. Oates, shorter and more reserved, was an accomplished guitarist and songwriter, but he seemed more comfortable supporting than leading. From the very beginning, their partnership had an inherent imbalance that both men accepted without fully understanding its long-term implications. Their first recordings together revealed this dynamic clearly. Hall naturally gravitated toward the microphone, his voice becoming the defining sound of their music. Oates contributed guitar work, harmonies, and songwriting ideas, but industry executives and audiences consistently focused on Hall as the star. This wasn't entirely unfair. Hall's vocal range and charisma were extraordinary, and his contributions to their songwriting were substantial. But it established a pattern that would echo through every aspect of their career. In interviews from the early 1970s, the difference was already visible. Hall spoke with the confidence of a frontman, discussing their artistic vision and creative process with authority. Oates often deferred to his partner, presenting himself as the supportive collaborator rather than an equal creative force. At the time, this seemed like a natural division of labor. Hall was comfortable being the face of the duo, and Oates appeared content to focus on the music itself. Neither man questioned whether this arrangement might eventually create problems. Their breakthrough success in the mid-70s cemented these roles permanently. When Sarah Smile became a hit in 1976, it was Hall's voice that radio listeners remembered. When Rich Girl topped the charts in 1977, Hall sang lead while Oates provided backup vocals and instrumental support. Album covers featured both men, but Hall's image dominated promotional materials. Concert audiences screamed for Hall specifically, while Oates became the talented musician standing beside the star. This dynamic might have remained manageable if both men had continued to view their partnership the same way. But success has a way of changing how people see themselves and their contributions. Hall began to understand himself as the primary creative force behind Hall and Oates, while Oates increasingly questioned whether his own talents were being properly recognized or compensated. Neither man discussed these growing concerns directly, preferring to focus on the undeniable fact that their collaboration was making them both wealthy and famous. By the early 1980s, Hall and Oates had become a commercial juggernaut, but the creative process that had once excited both men was becoming a source of quiet tension. Their album Private Eyes produced 3 major hits, followed by H2O, which included Man Eater, one of their biggest songs ever. To the outside world, they appeared to be at the peak of their collaborative powers. Inside the recording studio, however, a different story was unfolding. Hall had developed strong opinions about their musical direction, and he wasn't shy about expressing them. His vision for their sound increasingly dominated their sessions, while Oates found himself in the position of reacting to ideas rather than generating them. This wasn't necessarily the result of any deliberate power grab by Hall. His musical instincts were often correct, and his voice was undeniably the centerpiece of their success. But the cumulative effect was that Oates began to feel less like a partner and more like a highly skilled employee. The problem was magnified by how the music industry treated them. Record executives directed most of their communication toward Hall, assuming he spoke for the duo. Journalists asked Hall the important questions about their creative process and future plans, while Oates was often relegated to discussing technical aspects of their recordings. Even their own management seemed to view Hall as the decision-maker and Oates as the supporting player. This dynamic wasn't entirely unreasonable from a business perspective, but it created an emotional distance between the two men that grew wider with each passing year. What made the situation particularly painful for Oates was that his musical contributions were genuinely important to their success. His guitar work provided the foundation for many of their biggest hits, and his songwriting collaborations with Hall had helped create some of their most enduring music. She's Gone, co-written by both men, became one of their signature songs. Rich Girl featured musical arrangements that showcased Oates' instrumental skills. Yet somehow, these contributions seemed to disappear in public discussions of their success. Hall, meanwhile, was dealing with his own frustrations. He felt the weight of being the public face of their partnership, handling most interviews and carrying the burden of explaining their artistic choices. When their albums received criticism, the blame often fell primarily on him. When they needed to make difficult creative decisions, the responsibility landed on his shoulders. From his perspective, Oates was benefiting from their success without accepting equal responsibility for the difficult aspects of their career. Neither man was entirely wrong in their interpretation of their situation. Hall was bearing more of the public pressure and creative leadership, while Oates was receiving less recognition for his genuine contributions. But instead of addressing these imbalances directly, they allowed them to fester in silence. The very success that should have brought them closer together was slowly driving them apart, creating resentments that would poison their relationship for decades to come. The 1990s marked the beginning of what would become a decades-long slow-motion dissolution. While Hall and Oates continued to tour and occasionally record together, the creative partnership that had once defined them was quietly dying. Hall later revealed that the last song he genuinely co-wrote with Oates was sometime around 2000, meaning they spent more than 20 years performing together while barely collaborating as songwriters. This arrangement suited neither man, but both found reasons to continue. For Hall, the touring revenue was substantial, but more importantly, Hall and Oates remained his primary identity. He had built his entire career around this partnership, and walking away would mean abandoning everything he had spent decades creating. But continuing to perform songs they had written 20 or 30 years earlier, while pretending to maintain a creative relationship that no longer existed, became increasingly frustrating for him. He felt trapped in a partnership that had become an elaborate performance of their former collaboration. Oates approached their situation differently. He began developing projects that emphasized his identity as an individual musician rather than half of a famous duo. His solo albums allowed him to explore musical territories that Hall and Oates would never visit, and he seemed to find genuine satisfaction in this independent creative work. From Oates' perspective, Hall and Oates had become a successful business arrangement that funded his real artistic interests. There was nothing inherently wrong with this approach, but it required Hall to accept that their partnership was primarily financial rather than creative. The fundamental problem was that both men needed different things from Hall and Oates, and neither was willing to acknowledge that their needs had become incompatible. Hall wanted either a genuine creative partnership or a clean separation that would allow him to move forward independently. Oates wanted the financial benefits and name recognition of Hall and Oates while maintaining complete creative freedom in his individual projects. These desires could coexist temporarily, but they created an underlying tension that made every business decision potentially explosive. Hall's resentment grew stronger as he watched Oates promote himself as an independent artist while continuing to benefit from their shared legacy. In interviews, Oates would emphasize his individual accomplishments and artistic vision, then return to touring as half of Hall and Oates when it was financially advantageous. To Hall, this felt like having it both ways. Oates could enjoy the credibility of being a serious solo artist and the commercial benefits of their famous partnership, while Hall remained tied to an arrangement that he found increasingly restrictive and emotionally unsatisfying. By 2020, their relationship had become purely professional, maintained only for business purposes. They could still perform their hits convincingly, but the personal connection that had once sustained them through creative disagreements and industry pressures had completely disappeared. Hall later described feeling like he was performing with a stranger who happened to know the same songs. The explosion that finally destroyed any pretense of civility between Hall and Oates came in November 2023, when Oates attempted to sell his share of Hall Oates Enterprises to Primary Wave Music without consulting Hall first. For Hall, this wasn't just a business transaction. It was the ultimate confirmation that Oates viewed their 50-year partnership as nothing more than a financial arrangement that could be dissolved without even the courtesy of a conversation. Hall's reaction was swift and devastating. He filed a lawsuit to block the sale, but his language in court documents revealed emotions that went far beyond legal disagreements. He described feeling betrayed by someone he had trusted for most of his adult life. The man who had shared stages, recording studios, and decades of success with him was willing to make a major decision affecting their shared legacy without picking up the phone to discuss it first. In interviews following the lawsuit, Hall finally said what he had been thinking for years. He didn't just express disappointment with Oates. He revealed active resentment, describing his former partner in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. Hall admitted that he could no longer stand being around Oates, that their relationship had become so poisoned by years of unaddressed grievances that even basic professional courtesy had become impossible. The word Hall used most frequently was betrayal. Not disagreement, not creative differences, but betrayal. This choice of language revealed how deeply personal the situation had become for him. From Hall's perspective, Oates had spent decades benefiting from a partnership while systematically distancing himself from everything that partnership represented. The attempted sale to Primary Wave was simply the final act in a long process of abandonment. What makes Hall's hatred so intense is that it represents the collapse of something he had genuinely valued. This wasn't a business relationship that had run its course. For Hall, this was the destruction of a bond that had defined most of his adult life by someone who apparently viewed it as disposable. The depth of his anger reflects the depth of his original investment in their collaboration. Looking back, the tragedy of Hall and Oates is not that two successful musicians eventually went their separate ways. It's that two men who created something genuinely beautiful together allowed their differences to fester until cooperation became impossible. Their music brought joy to millions of people, but their partnership ended in bitterness that might have been avoided with honest communication decades earlier. Sometimes the relationships that matter most to us are destroyed not by dramatic conflicts, but by years of small disappointments that accumulate into something unforgivable.